Hello, Darkness here. I'm going to keep this short because I know a few people have complained about my intros being too long before I start my story. So before we begin, yes, it's true, Joey Testa passed away. His health had been deteriorating for a while now. Above is a brief dispute I had actually with his family a few years ago. His wife was upset that I was sharing some personal photos earlier in this series of them when they were having happier times together. It was his brother-in-law who wrote me. Joey's health had already been bad by then. At first I misunderstood what they were upset about and lashed out because I thought they were being threatening, but I was mistaken. They weren't being threatening. And once his brother-in-law explained what they were upset about, I felt bad about it and agreed not to use those photos again because, hey, his wife's not responsible for Joey's crimes, and I consider her a civilian. So I'll discuss that more later in the last episode. Lastly, I want to plug retired FBI agent Anthony Nelson's book. He was one of the two investigators, of course, the other being his best friend, Kenny McCabe, who did surveillance on Roy DeMeo and Nino. This is a great book. I was really impressed. It was fun, exciting for more than just Roy, but there are some Roy stories, as well as Scarpa, McCabe, and others. I strongly recommend this book. Check it out while you're waiting for mine. Now it's time to begin. Who were you, Roy? I'm gonna need you to start paying me back what you owe me. Just whatever you can. I want you to make the payments to Albert. Roy's voice was frantic. He was calling from a payphone or some such place. It's not clear from court testimony. I'm gonna be out of town for a while, taking care of business. Frank Frangi listened tensely on the other side of the line while Roy bellowed. Roy had loaned Frank thousands of dollars back in the early 70s, but Frank wasn't worried about paying Roy his money back. Roy had never threatened Frank. He could pay him whatever he would afford each week. They were like brothers. Frank was worried just about Roy himself. He had never seen Roy this upset since the Cuban crisis. So Frank agreed to pay Roy back whatever he could through Albert, and that was the end of the phone call. Now, before I continue this story, I just want to note something that's kind of interesting here. According to court testimony, Frank Frangi had used it to invest in his electrical business. However, when I spoke to Frank Frangi's younger brother, who's still alive and whose name I'm going to keep anonymous to maintain his privacy, that was false. Frank never used that money for his electrical business. Maybe Frank and Roy had been up to something shady, but that's pure speculation on my part. If it was, it probably wasn't anything terrible. Frank didn't really seem like the criminal sort. According to court files, that summer in '82, Roy got into a furious argument with ladies at home. She wanted to know where he was going. Couldn't just vanish for a whole month without her knowing. I mean, there were detectives who were watching the house, for Christ's sake. But you don't marry a mob boss like Roy if you're looking for sensitivity or feminism. They had made an agreement when they got married that it wasn't her business to ever know what he was up to unless he wanted to tell her. Just take care of the family while he was gone. Albert, well, he was terrified. He knew something was seriously wrong. Roy told Albert he'd fill him in more later. That secret place Roy was headed to was the Bahamas. He had a safe house there. He was thinking about faking his death and bringing his family there when it was time, so that they could all start all over. Gambling was legal in the Bahamas. There was money to be made. Meyer Lansky had known about it. In the States, Roy was doomed. Walter was closing in, and he had a choice between being whacked or spending the rest of his life in prison away from his family. Roy was gone for only a few weeks before he returned back home. Nobody knows what he was up to in the Bahamas while on the lam. During this period, Paul Castellano and Nino were extremely concerned, though, with what was being reported in the newspapers. Although Paul had no clue who this Vito was, this guy was squealing about dozens of unsanctioned murders, along with dealing drugs. And it was obviously connected to Roy, since Vito was talking about an auto theft ring too, and Canarsie was in Roy's territory. Nino didn't know about all these murders either. For years he had been telling Roy that there were already too many bodies to cut it out. Now Nino was beyond incensed as he was learning about this stuff. They were mobsters, not serial killers. And Roy wasn't done to adding to his body count either, because as soon as Roy returned, as soon as he flew back, 2 more murders were about to happen. A few years prior, 2 Bonanno associates and loan sharks had been part of a burglary and robbery crew. They'd gone around pretending to be cops. In fact, one of their targets had been Pete LaFrocia, who they'd knocked on his door and robbed him of his coke and jewelry. Now, while Murder Machine suggested that Roy didn't care much about Pete, that was actually incorrect. LaFrocia was in her crew, something Capici later acknowledged to me in an email. Pete just wasn't around much in '82 because he'd been told by Roy to leave for Florida. Sergeant Coffey had been hounding Pete, jumping out in front of his car and shouting that Pete tried to run him over, looking for any excuse he could find to beat the crap out of Pete and arrest him after he'd been acquitted for the Katz and Sherry murders, and was now linked to the psychopathic DeMeo Crew. And I want to make it clear that's not a knock on Capici and Mustaine, who are brilliant journalists, researchers, and authors. Capici is a hero of mine. Murder Machine is a masterpiece and got the vast majority of its facts correct, which is even more impressive given they had a lot less to work with. I strongly recommend it. It's always easy to get something wrong, as I have numerous times in this series and will correct in my book. Somebody complained recently that they weren't watching me anymore because I waffle too much. If you want an accurate story, you want somebody who's going to acknowledge what they were wrong about and correct it. If you want somebody who never waffles, listen to a politician or a fool. Now, these 2 Bonanno associates that had robbed Pete, their names were Anthony, who was the dad, Anthony Romano, and his son, John Romano. Anthony was in his early 60s, and John was in his early 30s. There had been 2 other members of that burglary crew who had robbed Pete, but Roy already whacked them. I covered that stuff earlier in this series. Roy just hadn't been able to get to these 2 guys because the younger of the 2, John, had been in prison for 5 years on a robbery charge. But Roy listened attentively when he learned that John was out and that he had been spotted in Brooklyn with his dad. Roy was looking to get some payback. Besides, he was stressed out all the time now, sitting in his kitchen late into the hours, slurping drink after drink from liquor bottles and shot glasses in his trembling hands, popping Xanax. The fear that everything was on fire all around him just wouldn't go away. He could practically feel the heat. Walter Mack, the FBI, the cops, they were coming for him. They had tapped his phones. Paul and Nino, he knew how unhappy they were. Freddie and Henry, now they're going to prison. And Roy didn't even have Chris around anymore to confide in. That one murder he still felt guilty about. So what's a better way to feel in control of your life again than that godlike feeling that came from several blasts with a .38 and shoving somebody into a bag or trunk? That July in '82, Roy managed to somehow either lure the Romanos somewhere isolated and demand they get on their knees, or else he met with them to have a talk, and then became suspicious of their stories. Either way, Roy executed them with a .38 in the back of their heads, several shots apiece, trussed their bodies up with cords, and left them in a parking lot. Since this was obviously a lot of work, somebody had to be with them, and that was probably Joe and Anthony, since they were still free. Several days after their murders, the decaying corpses of the father and son were found together in that parking lot in a plastic bag near some apartment buildings. A local smelled the rancid scent of death, peeked out the window, saw the bag lying below, and with wide eyes spotted a foot sticking out the rumpled mouth of that bag. That was the second time somebody found one of Roy's bodies by spotting a foot. First time was with cats. Meanwhile, Vito Arena was moved all over the country, protected by armed federal marshals. Even the mafia wasn't going to get to this guy. Now that this case included auto thefts, drugs, prostitution, human trafficking, loan sharking, but most importantly, dozens of homicides which include dismemberments, this is going to be huge. Although Auto Detective John Murphy had already collected a list of murders, a few with the help of Brady, O'Brien, and Winling, the NYPD wanted credit for the murders, and they were worried the media might give all the glory to the FBI if they didn't find a homicide detective assigned to the case, and so they looked around and found a reasonably competent murder investigator, Detective Frank Bergola, who was familiar with the crew from Chris Rosenberg's murder. And of course some very competent agents and detectives who would be working with Frank Bergola would include Ronnie Cardew and Agent Artie Ruffles, but not just them. FBI agent Marilyn Luke, a female agent, she'd be brought in too, but not just quite yet. This is just a small snippet of my interview with Harry Brady for my book that will corroborate what I'm saying, this growing army with Walter and what was going on at the time. So you know I'm not just talking out my ass.
Yeah.
So he brought homicide guys in. They brought a guy from Nassau County. They brought a guy from Angola, from Brooklyn South, somebody from Brooklyn North. You know, and that was just to fill the ranks to make sure that the police department was covered.
Brady's a smart, likable, charismatic cop. He's very funny. He's got a sardonic sense of humor. He played a major role in bringing down the crew, as you're going to hear about in the final episode. That should make it clear all these detectives are sitting in the same meeting with Walter, and they're all present in dealing with Vito. There wasn't one detective just working homicide, one detective just working auto. One detective wasn't more important because he was in homicide. And when these guys weren't sifting through files and in meetings, Harry and Brady were out there doing surveillance like Nelson and Kinney had been doing. Harry and Brady would wait outside Roy's mansion. They knew about the bugs. They were outside the Gemini Lounge and especially outside Patty's garage. Patty knew them by sight. Often when Patty Tester, as young hoodlums, would spot Brady and Murphy in their car, they would shout and snarl and bristle, "I know you cops! I know you cops! You better get the fuck out of here!" And Brady would gruffly mumble to Murphy, "It's these punks again." That was an issue Patty, along with Freddy, had about mouthing off to police, and they would only do so to certain police, the ones you weren't going to get a billy club enema from. Patty could get away with taunting and threatening Brady, Murphy, McCabe, Pergola, or FBI agents a lot easier than he could some of the other cops. Coffey, in his book, The Coffey Files, admitted he'd abused suspects, and at least one detective I talked to, none of the guys named, acknowledged he'd punch a wise guy right in his mouth if he mouthed off to him. This is an era when crime was out of control. There were no body cameras. Dirty Harry was popular in the theaters just a few years prior, and you had to worry about an officer's discretion and total mercy if he happened to take the insolence directed at him a little too personally. Popular public sentiment during this time was furious with guys like Patty Testa, and even Hollywood was on board throughout the 80s with such movies as Lethal Weapon and Die Hard, in which a cop is beating the crap out of some psychopath or punk for reasons that are legitimate. Back at the MCC and in jail in upstate New York, Freddy DeNome languished, waiting for prison. For the past few years, life had been really hard on Crazy Freddy. Divorce, custody fighting, and right before he'd been arrested, Freddy's own best friend, Roy DeMeo, had been about to kill him. He'd even made preparations, and gone so far as to tell Anthony and Joey that he was going to whack Freddy. According to Empire City Under Siege by Craig Nelson, Roy had said he was planning on whacking Freddy when he found out that Freddy had threatened Kenny's family. Although Joey and Anthony apparently believed Roy's reasons, I think Roy might have actually been homicidally furious with Freddy, because when he was talking to Detective Gately, that cop that he thought was his friend and was a corrupt cop, the same detective that told McCabe that Freddy was threatening him and his wife and kids behind his back, well, during the time they were talking, Freddy had also dry snitched to Gately about a flea market drug operation, according to court files, that Roy and Sal Ruggiero had been involved in. I think Roy was more concerned about that, since that could get them all killed, and he just didn't want to tell Joey and Anthony about that part, because they might panic or they might kill Freddy themselves, and he probably wasn't even sure he wanted to kill Freddy at that point, since he didn't. He just liked Freddy too much, and because he didn't want the twins to know just how bad their operation was disintegrating, and how much the cops knew now. Either way, during the late summer of '82, Roy finally visited Freddy in the MCC, where they spoke together in the visiting section. By now, Freddy had heard all about Vito, at least as much as the news were reporting. Now, this scene I'm about to tell you about, I got from court records, and it's all off the top of my head. I didn't go over them right before telling you this scene. I have the details written in my manuscript. In any event, I can remember most of it. I was at a prison a few times in my life, and one of those prisons was in New York. I went to interview John Gotti, the Grid Kid Killer. I might talk about him as its own episode. I probably will at some point. So I'm not entirely sure what the situation looked like in this particular occasion. Freddy's dressed in a jumpsuit as he's listening when Roy first visits him. Presumably, they would have been seated at a table, as I was with Juka, or Freddy would have been behind a glass pane, like in the movies. Roy then muttered, "Vito left no stones unturned," glumly, to which Freddy and Roy began conversing. Then, Freddy, who's trying to be helpful and is comically impulsive, at times incompetent in some of his suggestions, suddenly mentioned the name of this guy. His last name was Jewish, or at least sounded Jewish, wasn't Italian, somebody I hadn't heard before. But in any event, it was one of Roy's associates. And he suddenly insisted that this guy's a snitch based off his gut feeling alone. He has no proof. At which point, Roy frowned and said, "Prove it." And that's another example that despite Sammy Gravano and others' insistence that Roy was always the devil incarnate, this murder machine who would always kill people just based off a hunch, that's not necessarily true, especially if he liked you. Sometimes true, depending on how paranoid he felt at the time, but not always. And it was another example of how complicated Roy could sometimes be. He was undoubtedly a terrible person, undoubtedly a disturbed psychopath, but he'd have moments of restraint. Sometimes Roy murdered under the influence of alcohol because he was drunk, paranoid, anxious, and he had very temperamental moods, possibly bipolar, but that's just speculation on my part based off his family history. But I have to respectfully disagree with Capici that Roy always restrained himself because he had this grandiose sense of godlike fantasies of letting you live out of a sense of power. From court record there, he seemed irritated at the notion of whacking whoever that guy was, that associate, perhaps because he genuinely liked that guy. In any event, it was another example of Roy's sudden unexpected moments of bridling his homicidal impulses and suspicions. Another, of course, being that black guy I mentioned last episode who had spotted him murdering Patrick Penny. And yet Roy was still one of the most dangerous mobsters in American history, and he was unstable. Don't think you would have been given that benefit of the doubt unless you were a close friend or making him a lot of money. Through the year 1982, Paul Castellano and Nino were extremely concerned. News reports were coming out, but they were coming out slowly. There would be one that came out not long after Vito was arrested, which I talked about last time, and there was another report that was coming out that fall that would be even more damning to Roy. Walter subpoenaed Roy for that December, and he told me that during the course of this research he never expected Roy to actually show up to testify for what he was planning for him to testify for, but it was a matter of formality, and besides, Walter would finally get to meet this infamous killer, who was a major figure in his investigation, even if the real prize was Paul Castellano. That's who he had his sights on. The FBI were preparing to enter Paul's house and bug it over in Staten Island, the big White House, and it was a race between Walter Mack and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to try to take down Big Paul first. Meanwhile, Nino had been demoted over the Eppolito debacle, and for Roy's mistakes and acting erratic and everything that was happening with him. It was embarrassing. It was infuriating. He was angry with Roy, and he was angry with how things were going. The once formidable Nino was a soldier now, not a capo anymore. Nino was technically the same rank now as Roy, even if Roy still answered to him. He should have been Paul's consigliere someday, or maybe an underboss. That is, if he decided to ever move back to New York full-time instead of living a semi-retired existence in Florida. But there's no chance of that now, even if Nino did come back. That had to chagrin Nino. Nino was also genuinely concerned about how Roy was behaving, with all these accounts of Roy's unsanctioned hits and other behavior. And so he told Paul something which he genuinely believed, that he thought Roy was getting weak and that he wouldn't stand up if he got grabbed. Roy was popping pills, which Nino considered weak and unmanly. Roy had put on 15 pounds. Nino, in his own words, said Roy was acting like a maniac. So Paul had to do something about Roy if he couldn't be controlled, to have to get rid of him. And Paul knew Roy might have to be whacked for years now. Paul had never even wanted Roy made. Nino had pestered him into it, because Nino didn't want to lose Roy, his biggest earner and most capable killer, with his most powerful crew, to Paul Vario or Fat Tony Salerno, both of whom Roy had done work for and courted. "This Roy is causing me real problems," Paul complained to his captains. Paul also called Frankie DeChico in, who knew Roy better than most of his other men, and who was also a capable killer. What they spoke about is still not clear, but eventually DeChico and Paul called in John Gotti, who led the infamous Gotti crew in Queens. The Gotti crew were among Paul's second most powerful crews, and they were rivals of the DeMeo Crew. Paul didn't like John Gotti much. He really didn't like him any more than he did Roy. He'd even berate John Gotti publicly in front of others, humiliating Gotti at times, to the point that John Gotti would become visibly anxious. However, he was going to need muscle to take Roy out if he had to. "John, I want you to take a look at Roy. See what you can find out about him." What Paul meant by "see what you can find out about him" was obvious. "We're probably going to get rid of this guy, and we want you to find out if you can do it." John Gotti would be more than happy to see Roy go. They respected each other, but they had never really liked each other. And Roy had always been loyal to Nino, and Nino, despite being demoted, was still intensely loyal to Paul. If Roy went, that meant the DeMeo Crew would probably be dismantled. And if you get rid of the DeMeo Crew, Gotti wouldn't have to worry about Paul sending them after him if he decided to get rid of John for dealing heroin, a scandal that he was involved in thanks to Angelo Ruggiero, his friend, and another Gotti crew member, after he'd been caught dealing drugs on tape recently. But besides having to worry about Roy coming after him if Paul decided to whack him, Roy was really the only thing that was keeping John Gotti from whacking Paul besides his own loyalty to the Gambino underboss Della Croce, his mentor and friend. But Della Croce, he was old and he wasn't in good health anymore. When Della Croce finally died, which is something that John didn't want to happen, he did care about Della Croce. But it's not like he had any control over him dying. Well, that would change the balance of power. Here you had Big Paul walking around Manhattan with just his brain-dead sycophant, Toady, Bellotti. And it didn't seem like Bellotti was even armed most of the time. Talk about piss-poor security. If you've ever been out on a night with two friends who were decent size, you had better protection than Big Paul did at that time. Big Paul, he was really vulnerable, both physically and in terms of power, since a lot of people didn't like him. If John could just convince the other Gambinos Paul deserved to go, it'd be a chance of jumping from capo to boss himself. And he wouldn't have to be worried about being whacked or demoted anymore for dealing drugs. In addition to all that, John resented Paul for bullying him over the years, treating John like he was less than Paul because he was a street guy, talking down to him, yelling at him in front of other people. Big Paul, he thought he was so much better than John? He liked to eat alone? Well, okay, he can die alone, but getting rid of Roy, that was going to be a problem. So afterward, John Gotti began asking around about Roy. How many guys did he have? How many had he killed? How many had his crew killed? He and the Gotti crew did surveillance on the Gemini Lounge, and Gotti soon found out that Roy had at least 20 killers working for him. That's against John Gotti's 8 main guys. And a lot of these DeMeo crew members, of course, were young. You already know that. Young guys listened easier and didn't question orders as much. They looked at Roy as almost like a godlike figure. You weren't even supposed to talk to Roy if you didn't know him that well in the Gemini Lounge. And at this point, it's not clear if John Gotti had even actually pulled a trigger on somebody himself. He had lured people before. He had helped, but Gotti's first technical hit had been the gangster James McBratney, and that had been a disaster. Gambino had ordered McBratney killed after he had murdered his nephew, Emmanuel Gambino, in what may or may not have been an accident. I'm not an expert on Carlo Gambino, and I've read different accounts. So in retaliation, Carlo Gambino, he offered to give Gotti and Angelo and this guy Ralph Galloni their buttons if they'd kill McBratney, even though the books weren't open yet. They certainly were down for that, and they accosted this McBratney at Snoop's Bar and Grill in Long Island, a restaurant. McBratney was inside. He's this towering guy, well over 6 foot, muscular. He was eating his food, and all of a sudden these 3 thugs come up and they claim to be cops. No, they're not cops. He knows that. He can tell that they're gangsters. Suddenly there'd been a tussle, and James is just flinging these guys back, even though there were 3 of them, and they really were struggling, but they start to overpower James. Bam! Gun goes off. Ralph Galloni just went ahead and lost his nerve and shot James, even though Gambino had ordered him tortured first. Gambino was going to be pissed over this and take it out on Galloni. After the James McBratney disaster, John Gotti was immediately arrested since he had been right there at the scene, struggling to pull James McBratney outside. John Gotti in return secured the infamous Roy Cohn as his lawyer. As you might remember, I mentioned Roy Cohn in this series and broke him down. Roy Cohn, he managed to secure a 4-year prison sentence for John Gotti for a manslaughter charge. That prosecutor must have been really weak, because it was obviously second-degree murder. And Gotti in return was made a soldier when he got out. Now after that, Joseph Massino, well, he placed Gotti at a hit on Vito Borelli in 75, but that probably didn't happen since Gotti was in prison during that period of time, and Vito Borelli probably wasn't killed till 1980. I don't think Gotti was even involved in that hit, or if he wasn't a shooter. So it seems like Gotti was really better at ordering hits than carrying them out directly himself. That didn't make him a coward. I'm not saying Gotti was weak, but he wasn't as bloodthirsty or the stone-cold killer that Roy DeMeo was, Anthony Casso, Greg Scarpa, or even Sammy Gravano. Now, that's not to say John Gotti didn't have some guys in his crew who were extremely dangerous and definitely capable killers. And I'm not referencing Angelo Ruggiero either. The two toughest and most formidable killers in Gotti's Bergen crew were almost undoubtedly the Carniglia brothers. John and Charles Carniglia. Those two guys, they could pull off a hit. But even John and Charles Carniglia hadn't killed nearly as many men as Joey and Anthony, let alone Roy DeMeo. And even getting close to any of those three guys, who were usually together, and always packing, and always paranoid too, and ready to open fire, was going to be next to impossible. It's just not going to happen. Plus, Roy had all these other assholes with him now. Seems like he was training new guys. Gotti wasn't familiar with any of these people, and then there were rumors that Roy had military weapons stockpiled. They were ready to go down Scarface style. And perhaps even worst of all, John Gotti was told by some of the guys he talked to that even if you killed Roy or the twins, they were so obsessively loyal to each other, the others would come after you. They were like a fucking death cult, not just gangsters. When John Gotti reported back to Paul Castellano, he looked pale. He relayed to Paul Castellano that this guy has a small army of kids around him and that they were each killers. According to Pete LaFrocia, John Gotti said that if you kill one of them, the others will come after you. And they were always on their guard. John Gotti or any of his Bergen crew tried to whack Roy, it was going to be a bloodbath, and at least a few of them would probably get hit. That is, if they even survived. And if they did, a gun battle in the street was probably going to draw a lot of attention from the cops. Roy wasn't turning his head to these guys. The Bergen crew were outnumbered and outmatched by the number of killers in Roy's crew. Bodies everywhere, heat from the cops, arrests. Be a Pyrrhic victory. And obviously I'm paraphrasing here, since John Gotti wasn't exactly the most articulate guy like a lot of mobsters, and he probably wouldn't have even known what a Pyrrhic victory meant. But John Gotti would have understood the concept. A Pyrrhic victory is when the casualties and other consequences of winning a war are so costly that it isn't much better than defeat, if at all. Now, it isn't true that John Gotti refused to perform a contract on Roy to Paul Castellano. That wasn't Gotti's decision. If he refused a contract, Big Paul might have him killed too. However, Paul Castellano understood why John Gotti was hesitant, even afraid, of trying to whack Roy DeMeo. If things went awry, it could come back and hurt him too, by bringing heat, and he would lose crew members. So Castellano consented to let John Gotti pass on the contract. He needed somebody who could actually get close to Roy that Roy trusted a little. Eventually, Lucchese capo Anthony Casso came to Paul as he had an idea. As you recall, Anthony Casso was Roy's business partner in the shrimp boat and drug smuggling trade. And he wanted Roy gone too. Gaspipe was worried. He'd heard street rumors Roy was thinking about turning rat. And a rumor to the anxious and reptilian Gaspipe was just as good as proof as far as he was concerned. He didn't believe in taking chances if he didn't care about you. Roy and Gaspipe, they'd had a respectful business relationship based off mutual understanding that they were both powerful and dangerous, and big-time earners who were making each other a lot of profit, but they didn't care about each other on any personal level. And Gaspipe knew if Roy snitched, it was over for him too. Roy would talk about the millions that Gaspipe and Roy had made, smuggling and dealing lewds, marijuanas, weapons, and whatever else, and that's a possible life sentence. But Gaspipe had a henchman that was very loyal to him, Frank Lastrino, and Frank Lastrino not only dealt drugs with the twins, who also had a hit on them from Paul Castellano, but Frank Lastrino had known Joey, Anthony, and Patty for their entire lives. Meanwhile, Roy knew he was in trouble. That December, Roy drove with Shargell, his lawyer, to Walter's office to answer the subpoena. It would be the first time they ever met face to face. So Roy walked in, fastidiously groomed, accompanied by his lawyer, and there was nothing threatening about his demeanor. In fact, Walter told me that Roy was a perfect gentleman, and he immediately said, "Hey, I just want to let you know I got nothing against you. I understand you're just doing your job. I'm completely innocent, and we're going to take care of this. Once this is behind us, maybe we can even be friends. I hear you like horses. I like horses too," Roy said gregariously. "I understand," Walter said. That's where Roy got his famous mugshot, where he looks grim, and he got his fingerprints taken, and not much more went on after that. Out on the battlefield, Detective Kenny McCabe and FBI agent Anthony Nelson continued to do surveillance together, which they had been doing now for about 5 years almost. Nelson would be in the driver's seat. Kenny would be sitting next to him with a notebook pad, pen, binoculars, and a camera. And while Roy DeMeo and his crew of homicidal-loving cretins were the most dangerous and formidable crew in New York City, Nelson and McCabe did surveillance on many others. And while they might not have been Roy DeMeo, these notorious figures were still very dangerous. One day, Kenny and Nelson were parked outside the Diplomat Hotel, which you might recall was where Khalid Dowd had been staying at right before Roy and Henry whacked him. Well, on this day, there was no Roy nearby. Instead, Kenny and Nelson were there to do surveillance on some Colombos. And while they were outside seated in the car watching, suddenly there was a heavy whack that felt like it shook the car. The two startled investigators whirled around their car seats. The hell? A large brutish-looking figure approached their window. It was the burly Gregory Scarpa, staring down at Kenny McCabe, grinning playfully.
Hey, Casso, you looking for me?
Nelson, who was proficient in Italian, watched awkwardly. He was caught off guard that a mobster had just called Kenny a Casso and struck their car. The word Casso means cock or dick in Italian, so basically Scarpa had just called Kenny a dickhead.
If I were looking for you, Greg, you'd already be in handcuffs,
Kenny said, and he purposely kept his demeanor stern. It was almost a game they were playing. He didn't want any of Scarpa's friends on that occasion to notice that they knew each other better than they let on. McCabe was one of the few detectives, you see, one of the few anybody outside the FBI for that matter, who knew Scarpa was an informant. Later, when Nelson learned the FBI trusted Kenny enough to share that secret with him, he was both impressed and surprised. But that's just how much everybody knew they could trust and rely on Kenny McCabe, even the FBI. However, I want to be emphatic here that Agent Nelson was also a top-notch FBI agent, on par with Kenny. Nelson and Kenny came to find that they both worked very cohesively together with shared values and talent, and that they had a keen eye for recognizing the most salient mafia figures, the guys that the other gangsters were all eager to impress. They both put in an equal amount of effort. It wasn't just Nelson playing the limo driver. They both watched the mobsters come and go, often late into the evening. They conversed. They were both highly intelligent men who put their ideas together, asked each other for their opinions. Nelson and Kenny, as equal partners, figured out who Nino Gaggi was, that he was a capo, and not just a capo, but a capo who was close to Paul Castellano, and that Roy worked for Nino. Kenny and Nelson relayed their discoveries to Walter Mack and his boss, U.S. Attorney John Martin at that time, who Rudy Giuliani would take over for a year later in '83. And that information was going to help them build one of the early RICO cases. Nowadays, RICO's synonymous with the mafia and taking down the mob, but not back then. Back then, it was only about a little over a decade old, and it hadn't been used a lot against the mafia yet. So, by learning that Roy worked for Nino and that Nino was a capo who received kick-ups from Roy, who then kicked up a percentage to Paul Castellano, that was going to allow Walter to pursue those RICO charges against Nino and Paul. Kenny and Nelson continued to do surveillance at the Gemini Lounge. They also noticed Roy's demeanor had changed. He just wasn't cocky or as confident anymore. He'd glance around with wild eyes, gazing up and down the walls of Veterans and Friends in the Gemini, looking for bugs. Roy hardly spoke to Nino anymore, despite being acting capo or whatever nebulous rank Nino actually held, since he was technically a soldier but still acted like a capo. And Roy knew he was in big trouble. But now Nelson, Kenny, Walter, they wanted to drive that point home to him because Roy could bring the whole thing down. Out on the streets, Kenny and Nelson waited until they finally spotted Roy alone. They knew urging him to flip while anybody else was around, especially his friends and bodyguards, would only hasten Castellano and Nino's desire to eliminate this wounded cowboy. And on one occasion, when they spoke with him, Roy responded sullenly with a sad look in his eyes. "What's the matter, Roy?" Kenny said. That's when something really strange happened, something the impervious and arrogant killer had never shown them before. It's when Roy blurted out, "After everything I've done, and I'm nothing but a black sheep to my family." "Well, it looks like you've done pretty well for yourself here," one of the pair, I think Kenny but maybe Nelson, said. "Doesn't matter. I'll never be anything but the black sheep," Roy lamented. Roy was isolated and depressed, and they noticed that. He didn't really have anybody to talk to. You can't go to therapists in the mob. That's a death sentence. They don't know what you're going to say. Talking to Albert, well, that's just stressing him out more, and you don't want to look weak around your friends, ever. Leaving the house had become terrifying for Roy. Walter, cops, FBI, hitmen everywhere. If Roy turned rat, he would hate himself. Hate himself for being something nobody respected and everybody despised. His family would have to go into witness protection, and that's presuming Walter would even take him. After all, Roy had killed more people than all the other crews combined. Then there was the faking his own death, going on the lam. His wife and kids would always be living in fear. And for what? The mob might not find them, but the FBI almost certainly would. Hiding from the government forever was almost impossible, especially when you'd kill more people than Jack the Ripper and Boston Strangler combined. Roy was beaten down now. He wasn't the old Roy. His moods had always been unsteady, but now he was tired all the time, terrified and brimming with regret. It was the Cuban crisis all over again, only now they were guys he had known for years. The mafia are a lot like piranhas. There's no going to therapy, there's no pity, there's no mercy. You're tough and you thrive on power, respect, and fear. You get what you want. But the moment there's blood in the water, the moment you're wounded, the other piranhas sense opportunity, and they'll converge on you. Roy had been the biggest predator in the aquarium for a long time, but now he was bleeding. Now he was wounded. Now Roy felt despondent and mortified. The world had come alive. Every door in the street might have an assassin waiting behind it. Every window could have a killer with a rifle watching below. People approaching him on the street, cops that he didn't recognize, they might all be working for the Gambinos or the Lucchese, with a gun and a contract, waiting to plug him with holes. Roy's eyes flickered everywhere he went when he was outside. Bushes, cars, buildings, people. When he was in the city, Roy trudged through the streets, making sure his back was never vulnerable to anybody. By the winter of 1982, Roy was picking up the money that Frank Frangi owed him directly. It was $30,000. And Roy told Frank Frangi,
If anything should happen to me, I want you to pay Albert back the money you owe me directly. I don't want my guys handling it.
Roy, nothing's gonna happen to you, Frank said.
But if anything does, just promise me you'll pay my family back directly and make sure they're taken care of.
I don't want Albert involved in that life anymore. I should have never exposed him to it. Frank Frangi promised he would make sure Roy's family got their money if anything should happen to him. Meanwhile, Kenny and Nelson continued to do surveillance at the Gemini Lounge, and they knew that pretty soon Roy would be arrested and brought in, along with the rest of the guys. They also knew from John Gotti's wiretaps that Paul Castellano was definitely looking to take Roy out, although it didn't take a wiretap again to figure that out. That was obvious. So on another occasion, Kenny and Nelson spotted Roy ambling away from the Gemini Lounge, and this time Kenny poked his head out the window and said,
Hey Roy, don't end up in the back of a trunk. Come help us.
Suddenly, Roy wheeled around and gazed at Kenny with a look of terror. He wants to help us. He really does. Roy doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to leave his kids without a dad. Then Roy grinned and chortled, but there was no real mirth in that laughter. He knew he was probably going to get killed. Piranhas were closing in, and Roy really didn't want to die. He was terrified. I can get Roy to flip, Kenny felt emboldened. I just need enough time to work him. Roy could take the whole mafia down. He knew everything. Unfortunately, time had just about run out. It isn't clear whether Roy would have flipped. Kenny believed he would, according to his son Duke, whom I've spoken to. Nelson, he's not so sure. Wendling, I've spoken to him, and he said Roy seemed to be on the fence about it from his nervous reactions. Pete LaFrosia, Dominic Montiglio, and the twins didn't think Roy would have flipped, but what the twins thought didn't matter. Nino felt like Roy was getting weak and that he might flip. And whatever Nino thought, Paul would have thought too. Plus, neither wanted that maniac working for the family anymore, or any mafia family for that matter. Brought too much heat and it was offensive for him to be killing everybody like that. Roy had done just too much damage. During the 1st of July, 1983, Roy had called Frank Frangi to remind him to come to his daughter's house on the 10th to have some cake. And although Murder Machine's account differs, it was incorrect. Frank would last see Roy that weekend before a birthday heading outside a shopping mall. He had just bought a present for his daughter, and he'd waved to him, and that's pretty much the extent of it. It was January 9th, 1983, Sunday, evening. Roy pondered his life that night in his room. He wasn't stupid. He knew the twins had a contract on their lives too. Roy knew Joey and Anthony wanted to live. They wanted to live, and they both knew their crew chief was doomed. That he was mentally falling apart right before their eyes. Roy had been talking about suicide for months, about how it was only a matter of time before Walter's men moved in, or he got clipped first. Roy also knew the twins were close to Frank Lastarino, and Lastarino worked for Anthony Casso. Casso had no reason to trust a guy as dangerous and unstable as Roy DeMeo. Like Nino, months before, Joey and Anthony had also been distant recently. When your friends became distant, that usually meant you were going to get whacked. Nobody wanted to keep bonding with the friend they were about to whack. It was traumatizing enough. So that night, Roy decided to call his son Al into his office. He wanted to talk to him about what he thought was about to happen. Al, what would you do if something happened to me? What would you do if I got killed? What do you mean, what would I do if you got killed? I'd find the guys who did it and kill them, Al stammered. Suddenly Roy's eyes ignited, and Albert glimpsed something in his father he had never seen before. Whatever he glimpsed terrified him. Roy advanced forward and grabbed Albert by the collar and shoved him backwards, seizing a hold of him.
No, you're not. You're not gonna do nothing. You hear me, Al? You're gonna throw me in the garbage and forget about me, and then you're gonna go on with your life, Roy said coldly.
Roy was desperate to get Albert away from that world. He resented himself for ever getting Albert involved in his business to begin with. He was no killer, but that wasn't the only reason Roy was upset. Roy had failed. He was never going to be somebody that everybody respected, that ran the whole city. Roy had even failed as a father and a husband. Here he was, his wife distraught and bitter with him, his kids' mental health deteriorating. A part of him seemed to think that's just where he belonged, in the garbage, along with all of his victims. There was disgust there in those orbs, rage, murderous rage, but not towards little Al. The darkness, the wrath that Roy held in his eyes wasn't there for Albert. He could never intentionally hurt Albert, but it might have been there for somebody else, for Roy himself this time. Roy knew he was a monster. He boasted he'd end up in hell, but he also knew he could have been something else, something like his brother Anthony had been. Maybe a doctor or a hero of some sort, something better than this prison his choices had brought him to, something better than the black sheep that disgusted his uncle and his cousins, who didn't even know a quarter of just how bad he really was. Roy might have been something much better than the thing that had disappointed his own pops before he died. And what would his brother Anthony think of him now if he were alive today and knew about the crimes he had committed? Dealing drugs? Dealing child porn? Who could stand that? Murder after murder? That had been the opposite of what his big brother Anthony had been. He'd been a hero. He'd been noble. He'd been a patriot. He'd been a protector. Anthony might be dead, but he died standing for something. Roy was a macabre distortion of the American dream, whose own friends were probably ready to kill him. And now Roy didn't have those grandiose fantasies anymore to distract him from the thing that he really was. It's clear in those final days and conversations with Frank Frangi that Roy really had regretted joining the mob. But make no mistake, Roy was just too sick by the time he became an adult to be the kind of man Anthony Jr. had been, to be even remotely close to it, even if Roy could have done it all over again. That better Roy had died with his big brother Anthony, who had been raising him to be a much better person. Roy eventually settled off to bed, though it wouldn't surprise me if he had trouble sleeping that night. The next day, Roy got dressed. He was about to leave when his wife, Lady, reminded him to take the chandelier with him. Still needed to be fixed. Although nobody knew where he was headed, Roy didn't talk about his business unless he wanted you to know about his business. Roy was headed to Patty's garage. There, Joey, Anthony, Patty, and maybe Carlo were waiting for him. Nobody else was going to be there. Not Nino, not DeChico, nobody else at all. Roy was there just to pick up money. But before he left, Roy left his wallet and watch behind, a telling sign. Probably wasn't convinced for sure that his kids might try to whack him, but he certainly suspected it. Meanwhile, Albert convinced himself things weren't that bad. This was probably just more of his father's paranoia, that maybe things would be alright in the end. His dad had made arrangements that day for his daughter's birthday. Frank Frangi was supposed to be there. They were all going to have cake. Roy plodded outside and rumbled away in his car. Unfortunately, it would be the last time Albert ever saw his father again. Things were about to become a nightmare, one that poor little Al was never going to quite wake up from.